Good morning, good afternoon, late afternoon to our friends in Ukraine. This is our third meeting in the series of Conversatoria, which is a part of the semester-long fellowship program we are conducting here at the New School for Social Research. We are organizing it, and when I say we, it is Transregional Center for Democratic Studies. Lala Pop is the queen of that realm and the director of the center. There are various events related to the Conversatorium. Half of the fellows are from Ukraine, the other half are from New School, not actually only from the New School, but very international group of fellows. And we thought about this Conversatorium as a teaching moment for us, for our own community at the New School, but not only the New School, and for that reason we open it up, and hence the webinar format. The Conversatorium really focuses on the past, present, and future of Ukraine and its regional context. On Monday, we met and talked with Yaroslav Hrycak, the foremost historian of Ukraine. Yesterday, we hosted Volodymyr Yermolenko, philosopher, writer, and journalist. Tomorrow, at 9 o'clock in the morning, not at 10, at 9 o'clock in the morning, we are going to meet Serhiy Zhadan, novelist, poet, performer, rock musician, and at 11 o'clock, from Kharkiv, I should add, from Kharkiv. At 11 o'clock, we will be meeting Oksana Kis, who this fall is a visiting professor at NSSR, but normally is from Lviv, from the Ukrainian Academy of Science. She's an anthropologist, and tomorrow she will, and feminist, tomorrow she will talk, her talk is on secret power, a secret power, normative femininity as source of women's agency in times of extreme violence. Today we are having with us Marci Shore. Marci Shore is already on the screen. Marci is an associate professor of history at Yale University, and it's a regular visiting fellow at the Institute für the Wissenschaften for Menschen in Vienna. Her formal and tight bio you can see on the chat. I will ask Lala, she probably already did that, to put also information about tomorrow's meetings and about the fellowship in general. The fellowship's name is is Transregional Dialogues, or at least this is a part of the title. I remember getting Marci's book, The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe. Let me just say, nevertheless, those of you who may not be able to open the chat, just to tell you, among her books are Caviar and Ashes, Warsaw Generations, Life and Death in Marxism, 1918-1968. The next one is the one I mentioned, The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe. And I remember getting that book at the launch held in a beautiful home near Wall Street, somewhere near Wall Street. Next day, it was Saturday morning, I began to read the book while still in bed. And I remember that I never got up from the bed until I finished it several hours later. I don't know, I never told Marci about it. This never happened to me before. You know, you have to get up, you have to eat, you have to do things. Marci is not only a great writer, but also an incredibly engaging speaker that you are going to experience in a second. Sorry, apologies, Marci. I know it's not comfortable to talk about it, but some of you may, in the audience, may remember her visiting us at the Democracy and Diversity Summer Institute we held in Wrocław. It was 2 years ago. It was 2 years before the pandemic. And she was talking then on her recent book, The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution. This is an extraordinary book. The book captures the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution. You know, we all watched it. We all watched Maidan, that what we we learned very soon it was Euromaidan. This is but the book is about that. It's about Maidan, but it's also, but then it goes further because the war had happened in Donbass. And the book makes us a part of the world where the distinctions between early day and night ceases to exist, when spaces become dense and visceral, and when one's regular life assume unheard of dimensions. And it's I highly recommend that book. Today, Marci is with us, and Marci is the only American speaker in that Conversatorium series. And she will be talking about the tasks of the translator on the meeting of bridges during the time of war. You know that when she talks about I think, I don't know, when she talks about translation, she's not just talking about translating word to word. It's really a translation of context, of political, of social, of historical context, of making people meet halfway through, I guess, hence the bridges. I am obsessed with bridges, so I'm very much with her about that. As before, Marci will be speaking 30 to 45 minutes, and then she will be joined by 3 of our fellows, who will be her interlocutors, who will enter into conversation with her about what she just said. And so in other words, they will be in dialogue with Professor Shore. And the fellows today, I will introduce them later. We've chosen everybody is kind of originally, or it is Ukrainian, because Marci is not. So this will be a slightly different group. One of the Ukrainian doctoral candidates actually studies at the New School, but 2 of them are currently in Ukraine. Their profiles, I'm quite sure that Lala will put them also on chat, and I'm finishing right now. Marci, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you, Elżbieta. Thank you, Lala. Elżbieta's purple hair always like cheers up my morning.
Post-COVID hair.
Yeah. I know. It was a brilliant idea and a brilliant response to COVID. Yeah, I'm getting over a post-COVID cough myself, so I'm going to try not to lose my voice. But if I do, you won't take it personally. I have a whole like pile of cough drops next to me, which you can't see. So it's a pleasure to be here. I've been so grateful to Elżbieta and Lala and her staff for all of the incredible organizing work they've done for Ukrainian students and scholars during this war. I mean, Elżbieta, for those of you who don't know her, is a kind of force of nature and is able to make things happen in a way that I'm rarely able to. Although sometimes I think that if I had Lala working for me full time, everything would be like, I could also manage to save the world, but I don't have anyone quite that competent. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to make a small contribution. I wish I could see you guys, but I can't. It's always a little weird, talking into a black box, because I'm not getting any feedback from the audience. So I'll just look at Elżbieta and see if I can tell from the expressions on her face if I'm pitching this right. So when I'm most of what I've done for the past 6 months has been, frantically run around and talk to people about Ukraine. Generally Americans, sometimes the British, the French, the Austrians, the Germans, but non-Ukrainians about Ukraine. That's been my main kind of job, and not just my job. I think, most of us, if not all of us who work in this field, have stepped up at this moment. And so then the question is, what do I say to Ukrainians about Ukraine, which is a much more awkward question, because generally I'm the person kind of being the bridge between Ukrainians and the rest of the world. And it feels very awkward then to be telling Ukrainians about Ukraine. And I was thinking about this moment I had when my book about the Maidan, which I'm happy to talk about during the questions if anyone is interested. It was unexpectedly for me translated into Ukrainian and published in Ukrainian, which I was flattered by, I was honored by, and I was also slightly awkward about, because the purpose of that book, of course, was to make people outside Ukraine understand what the Maidan had meant. I never conceived of myself as needing to explain people who participated in it, what it was all about. And then I was invited to Ukraine to give book talks when the book came out, and to take part in literary festivals. And I thought, what am I going to say? I can't tell the story of the Maidan to audiences who know it much more intimately than I did. And fortunately, there is both in Ukraine in particular and in East Central Europe much more generally a kind of tradition of giving the book talk via conversation and via dialogue. I had fantastic dialogue partners. I think we started with Yurko Prohasko, I had Ola Khaniatuk, I had Konstantin Sigel, I Serhiy Plohi. I had this fantastic array of interlocutors. And I thought, I'm just going to let them lead the conversation because they will know what their audiences are interested in or what I could tell them. And as soon as I started, I found that it wasn't awkward at all. It was really kind of fascinating and lovely, at least for me. I can't speak for the people in the audience, in part because they were totally different conversations. And what I learned during that trip was that what my Ukrainian audience wanted to hear was, not what happened on the Maidan. They knew perfectly well what happened on the Maidan, but they wanted to have more of a kind of meta conversation about what it means to be the cultural mediator, what it means to be the translator, as Elżbieta said, not just technically or not just linguistically, but also conceptually, historically. What does it mean to try to play the role of the bridge, between somebody and somebody else on the other side of the world? And I loved those conversations. I learned from those conversations. But I thought, yes, the people asking me the questions were right. That's a much more appropriate topic for me to be talking to Ukrainians or really anyone else about. So I was happy to have the chance to talk about that with you today. Elżbieta said that she's obsessed with bridges. I'm also kind of obsessed with bridges, and I can't take credit for that obsession. I think it comes from a long lasting connection with a very special place that many of you have been to, called Fundacja Pogranicze, the Borderlands Foundation, which is way up in northeastern Poland, on the Suwałki Gap, and you guys know what that means now, on the Polish-Lithuanian border, very close to Belarus, between Belarus and Kaliningrad, a place that used to have a very important Jewish population and a yeshiva, and they've done extraordinary things there. And I won't go into that because that take us slightly off in another direction. But the philosophy of that place, and has been articulated particularly well by our friend Krzysztof Czyżewski, is the philosophy of the bridge. And Krzysztof calls this the invisible bridge, the niewidzialny most. And the idea is that the invisible bridge that the other, niewidzialny most. And what does it mean to try to be the bridge? What does it mean to try to build bridges? What does it mean? What does it mean to try to rebuild bridges when bridges have been broken? There's a wonderful slogan, which for those of you who understand Polish at least a little bit, I'm sure you will need to know, and it will change your life. And for those of you who don't know Polish, you should learn it, if just for this slogan, which comes from Krzysztof, which is Niech most będzie z tobą. May the bridge be with you. And it is taken from the Polish translation of the Star Wars slogan, "May the Force be with you," which is Niech moc będzie z tobą. And if you just change, the letter at the end of most, it's Niech moc będzie z tobą. May the bridge be with you. And I like that, and I like it. I like it both as a project, as an aspiration, but I also like it as a way to explain the role of the writer and the role of the historian, because that's what I feel I do most importantly. And when I say I here, I really mean we. I feel like that is what my profession is about. That's what my work is about. How do you take listeners? How do you take readers? How do you get them to make this imaginative leap into a time and a place where they were not? This is what historians do. We need to make people from the past and places from the past come alive. We need to make the reader feel that these were real people. We need to make the reader feel that they could imagine themselves into their world. This is also what novelists do, except that, they're dealing with characters they may have made up, and we're dealing with characters from real life. Most of the time, as a historian, I'm writing about people who are no longer alive, which in some ways is more difficult, but in some ways is much less difficult. And at certain moments, somewhat, unexpectedly, such as during the Maidan, and such as during this gruesome war, we find ourselves talking about events in real time and talking about people who are very much alive. And that was difficult for me during the Maidan, in part because all of the advantages historians have over journalists or over political scientists comes largely from retrospect. Looking back, you can know more than any individual actor could know in real time. Looking back, and given if you work hard enough, if the sources are good enough, if you look at them critically, you can find out not just what A wrote to B, but also what B wrote back to A, and what B wrote to C, and what C wrote to A. And you can gain a picture that nobody could have possibly gotten in real time. Moreover, you have the advantage that Hannah Arendt talks about in The Human Condition, which is you have a sense of how events have played out. And Arendt likes to call this the fact that the actor is never the author of his or her own life story. It's only the historian looking back who can see what it's all about. And that is for the Hegelian reason that actions have consequences far in excess of their intent. It's the throwing the stone in the water analogy. Actions, because Arendt says, because of the boundlessness of human interrelatedness, have ripple effects that go on literally until the end of time, because we are all ultimately interrelated. And so speaking in real time, writing in real time, is very difficult. And I feel often very insecure and uncertain about it. And at the same time, the reason I did it during the Maidan, and the reason I've basically spent 6 months doing nothing else now, is because there are moments when it feels like those of us who can be bridges need to be bridges because bridges are needed. And I mean, one of the things I heard from a lot of people at the beginning of the war, I think especially maybe colleagues in human rights, or colleagues in political science, or colleagues in fields that are genuinely global and transnational in a way that doesn't require the same amount of area expertise. And they said, okay, well, now you are up 24 hours a day working on behalf of Ukraine, and trying to save those people. Well, why didn't you do this for Syria? Why didn't you do this for Somalia? Why didn't you do this for the Rohingya, in Myanmar? Which is a very good question. And I take that very seriously. And my argument was not that, the people I know personally are objectively, their lives have, greater moral worth than anybody else's life, but that I, in this situation, have a particular responsibility because this is a place and these are people I know. And this is where the empirical basis of history, I think, distinguishes historians from a lot of our colleagues in the social sciences. There's a sense that, even like my sociologist friends and my philosopher friends have a hard time understanding that you don't have the same right to weigh in on conversations about places of the world you don't know. You don't know the languages, you haven't been there, you haven't read the primary sources. It's not that you think those parts of the world aren't important, but you have spent years training in languages and training in archival sources so that you know one part of the world. The world is big and nobody can know the whole thing. And I would never consider myself an expert on the whole thing. And so I felt in this situation that, I, in the collective first person sense, like myself, my Slavicist friends, all of us, who have an empirical basis of knowledge, about Eastern Europe, about the former Soviet Union, we have to step up because this is what we know. We can be the translators. We know languages, not just literally, but also conceptually. And so that's been important to me. It's been very clear that this is our responsibility here and now. So let me maybe, I don't want to talk too long because I really want to hear what you guys have to say. And this is the kind of topic that, of course, works better when I can see people in person and figure out what is actually of interest to the audience. But I could talk a little bit about the various strategies that I employ, both as a speaker and a writer, because I think a lot of what's happening, has been, how do you communicate across borders? How do you make an experience, that's happening to one person in one place, understandable and comprehensible and relatable to people on the other side of the world? And this is a challenge that writers have. I mean, this is what in fiction writing, you call this a suspension of disbelief. You're supposed to start reading of the novel and forget that you're not there. You're supposed to read yourself into that. How do you make that happen? How do you make that happen in a world in which, we do not all share the same experiences? And this is a topic that came up in the States, very profoundly during the Black Lives Matter movement. What kind of right, do people who are not Black have to weigh in on these conversations? You can never understand what it means to go through the world in somebody else's skin, and be subject to those stereotypes and be subject to that kind of hostility and be subject to all sorts of things that you can imagine, but you can never really understand. And this is, and now I'll talk here very briefly as the kind of historian of philosophy, which is a lot of what I write about. This is an epistemological problem, right? It's a problem about knowledge. I mean, how do you see inside somebody else's soul? I mean, it's a variation on the classic epistemological question, which Leszek Kolakowski calls the problem of the bridge, which is, how do you get from subject to object? How do you get from inside your consciousness to the outside world, from inner to outer, from immanent to transcendent? How do you even know that, like, this coffee cup is real and it's not a projection of my consciousness? Because you can never get outside your own head. You're always kind of stuck inside your own consciousness. And so all the more so, how can you get inside, not just inside the coffee cup to determine what it really is, but how could you get inside the consciousness of another person to know how it actually feels to be that person? And of course, the answer is, like, there is no such thing as perfect access. And this was very much a point during Black Lives Matter movement, that, that people who are not Black can be allies, they can never really understand. And my argument here is that there is no such thing as perfect understanding. That's true. None of us has access to what's going on inside somebody else's soul. There are epistemological barriers. There's no such thing as transparent access. But as Freud would tell us, we don't even have transparent access to what is going on in our own consciousness, in our own soul. There's always an extent to which the self is hidden from the self. So perfect epistemological access is a kind of utopian fantasy. Nobody has it anyway. But that doesn't mean there's not such a thing as more or less. And the fact that we can't understand somebody else's experience perfectly and completely, I would argue, doesn't mean we can't understand at all. And between giving up and saying, okay, we can't understand anything, and making a kind of utopian totalitarian claim that we can understand everything, there's a lot of space in between. And my argument here is that our job is to kind of work with that space in between and try to move us to more understanding as opposed to less understanding, with a kind of epistemological modesty that there's no such thing as perfect understanding. And so that's the position, I would say, that I want to start from. Perfect understanding is not possible, but a lot of understanding is possible. I mean, I think empathy is possible. I think it's something that is worth trying for. I think it's something that can be present in greater or lesser amounts. I know that, one of the things I've learned from working on a part of the world that's not my own, that, students who are graduate students who are starting with me often come and ask me, and they say, well, if I'm Polish and I write about Polish history, am I always going to be biased? Am I never going to be objective because I'm too close? I know it too well. And then other students come and say, well, if I'm not Polish and I write about Polish history, am I never going to be able to understand, because I've never been inside. I never will be inside. I'll never know the language the way native speakers know it. And my answer is that, all positions come with epistemological advantages and disadvantages. There is no magical, there is no magical viewpoint from which, in Husserl's terms, you can see all sides of the cube at once. We're all starting from a certain perspective. And that perspective always is going to kind of come with its own obstacles and its own possibilities. And our job is to work with that. Our job is to keep trying. Our job is to try to understand as much as we can. I mean, one thing I have learned spending all this time in Eastern Europe, and one thing that, certainly I have experienced in my own skin in the past 6 months, is that attachment, of the whole idea of objectivity versus attachment and bias cannot be reduced to blood ties. It can't be reduced to race. It can't be reduced to ethnicity. In some sense, it seems to me that the most important division that kind of affects the subjectivity-objectivity continuum is people you know in person versus people you don't know in person. I feel like people I know in person, their lives always have a weight that feels more real to me, that cuts across all sorts of religious and cultural boundaries. I'm attached to Eastern Europe because I've spent my whole adult life hanging out there. And these are my friends, these are my colleagues, these are people I collaborate with, these are students I teach, they're your colleagues I work on collections with and organize conferences with, and these are like the people in my life. So I may have shown up in Eastern Europe, not knowing a single person. The first time I went to Prague, I didn't know a single person. The first time I went to Warsaw, I didn't know a single person. The first time I went to Kiev, I didn't know a single person in Kiev. But you develop attachment. So I mean, I would say I went into Kiev completely objective for the first time, into the summer of 2002. I did not know one single person in Kiev when I got off the train in Moscow. But I do not consider myself a neutral observer now, because in the past 20 years, it's become a very important place, and I've developed relationships and attachments, with many, many people there. So I would just say to look at the idea of objectivity, subjectivity, and attachment in a kind of more expansive way, which also opens the door to the fact that people can learn about, parts of the world that are not their own. I mean, Elżbieta has experience of working in South Africa. Like you show up someplace and it might be foreign, but it's going to become less foreign. And so our job is to make things less foreign. So I don't want to talk too much, but let me talk about maybe some strategies and devices.
No, you still have time, and talk about the strategies. This is what we want to learn. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So one of the ideas I keep coming back to is translation. And I'm one of the I'm an intellectual historian, which means that, I write about writers, I write about philosophers. Everything I do depends on, everything I write depends on translation. Because in order to make it real in English, I need to translate the voices of the characters and the people who I'm writing about. I'm also just interested in translation. As such, one of the projects I did as a graduate student was translate this extraordinary memoir from Polish, Czarny Sezoni, into English, which was a project I love. So I'm interested in translation as such. And as my friend Jirko Prohasko sometimes likes to say, everything is translation. All communication is ultimately about translation, because we're not inside one another's souls. And as anyone who's worked with translation knows, the question is, how do you translate the untranslatable? What can be translated better? What can be translated worse? What are there are always necessary losses. How do you cope with those losses? And one of the things I've written about relatively recently, in an essay that you guys can look up if you want, both on Public Seminar and Eurozine, on the uses and disadvantages of historical comparisons for life. That's a title I stole from Nietzsche, just like I stole the title from this talk from Walter Benjamin. And both of those men are dead. Presumably they don't mind, and titles can't be copyrighted. But yes, I did steal it from Nietzsche, who said the uses and disadvantages of history. I said the uses and disadvantages of historical comparisons. But one thing I do there is I look at translation, metaphor, analogy, and comparison together with various categories, like how we use fascism, how we use genocide, how we use totalitarianism. I look at them as kind of heuristic devices. I look at them as ways in which we understand the world, given the impossibility of transparency. and the great Polish theologian and philosopher Józef Tischner makes an argument in perhaps a little known but very pointed essay about metaphor, where he says, if perfect direct access were possible, it would perhaps be terrifying. You know, we need these heuristic devices. We need these interpretive strategies to mediate, you know, between our being inside our own heads and our own experience, you know, and the otherness of the world. If we had direct access to the world, there would be something kind of totalitarian and terrifying about it. If we had direct access to somebody else's soul. So translation, metaphor, analogy, comparison, using these categories, they are interpretive devices. They're frameworks. They're lenses that we use, you know, to help move our understanding forward. So one of the things I try to argue in this essay, first I should say that the essay was provoked by a certain event or a series of events, which took place in 2018 and 2019, which is when the Trump administration started taking children, refugees, away from their parents at the U.S.
Could you give us the
Mexican
title
border.
again of the essay,
Oh
Marci?
yes, on the uses and disadvantages of historical comparisons for life. I'm sure Lala can bring up the link. It was co-published by both Public Seminar and Eurozine as part of a forum that Jeff and Stephen Aaron and I co-curated. And this was the essay that kind of introduced the concept. So the idea, so I don't work on American history, I don't work on Mexican history, and I don't speak Spanish. So there are these refugees coming from, you know, fleeing violence in Latin America, you know, often, you know, going through hundreds of miles with very small children, you know, through the desert. They cross the border and the children are taken away from their parents and they're thrown in cages. And that this was during the Trump administration. And I mean, not just me, I was just paralyzed with terror, with disgust, with guilt. I grew up in an American Jewish community. I grew up with stories about children taken away from their parents. You know, I grew up around Holocaust survivors. I work with the Fortunov Archive, the Holocaust Archive here at Yale. Everyone who survived Nazism and Stalinism, who I met in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, you know, most of whom are no longer alive, but the survivors who I met then, you know, who taught me so much about this part of the world, everyone had a story about fleeing across some border, and they were there to talk to me in the 1990s because someone was kind to them on the other side. They somehow got lucky. And so I saw this happening, and I thought, like, you know, what can we do? And I talked to Stephen Naron, who's the director of the Fortunov Archive for Holocaust video testimonies here. And we decided to have some filmmakers put together clips of, you know, of scenes from testimonies about parent-child separation as a kind of provocation to think about the analogy between what happened then and what could be happening now. And that we would then ask writers from all different countries, all different places, from Romania, from India, from China, to look at this, you know, and to see what it makes them think of. And then there was Alexandra, excuse me, I'm losing my voice again. And then there was this point on the US-Mexican border when the Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez spoke about the detention camps as concentration camps. And at that point, the American Holocaust Memorial Museum issued a statement that, you know, quote unquote, unequivocally rejected efforts to create analogies between the Holocaust and other events, whether historical or contemporary. And that to me was a provocation. And the provocation was not just, was this like the Holocaust or was this not like the Holocaust? Because any given events have elements of both the irreducibly singular, you know, and the more universal. But the provocation was unequivocally rejects efforts to create analogies. And I thought banning thinking in analogies is basically banning thinking as such. because categories, analogies, comparisons, devices of translation, that is how people think. That's how cognition works across a whole range of planes. If we go back to Kant, who brokers this radical compromise between rationalism and empiricism, and he says what cognition means is a kind of synthesis between the sensory data we're getting in some way from the thing in itself, and these hardwired constructs, of how human consciousness works that are, bringing down to bear on it, that we have these pre-existing categories. And so one of the things I was arguing here is that we need these devices. They are part of how we process reality, and we probably need several of them at once. And so this act of being the cultural mediator, this act of being the bridge for me, involves a lot of literal translation. I mean, I've been doing a lot of translation lately from Russian, occasionally a little bit from Ukrainian, which I really don't know, but sometimes between the Polish and the Czech and the Russian, which I learned properly, I can figure it out, and my Ukrainian friends help me, and I have Ukrainian textbook here, but I've done quite a bit of translation from Russian, and so there's a literal translation that's going on. And sometimes there are whole concepts or words that need to be explained. During the Trump administration, I wrote a piece about for a series in foreign policy called Decoder, about key words in other languages that help us understand things. And I wrote about продажность and произвол. So this saleability, this idea that that anything, and more importantly anyone, could be bought or sold, and произвол, which is refers to a kind of arbitrariness tinged with tyranny, the idea that you're not a subject but an object, you're a kind of plaything of the powers that be, and talked about how these concepts had become central to the Trump administration, but we lacked the vocabulary, but we have the actual phenomenon. So there's literal translation. There's also, but I also play with a lot of metaphor, a lot of analogy, a lot of comparison, and different ones depending on which audience I'm talking to. Not to be manipulative, but to make a connection. And one of the things I argue is that historical comparisons, it's not an either or question. It's not that, yes, they're permissible, or no, they are impermissible. It's always a question of how. No two historical events are ever exactly alike. No two moments in history are ever exactly alike, just like no two human beings are ever exactly alike. But that doesn't mean that having had experience with some people can't teach us things about experiences we have with other people. So I'm gonna try not to throw too many of these big German philosophers out, because I know it sounds very pretentious, but there's some concepts that are very helpful. For Hegel, it was all about how do you synthesize the individual and the general, the kind of the irreducibly particular and the universal essence. I think Husserl has a better methodology for this. And Husserl's methodology, the phenomenological methodology, kind of works along two planes. And one he calls intuition, and one is intuition of essence. So I'm going to give you an apple analogy, which I like to use. So phenomenology is basically all about a method of exhaustive description. Like, how do I know anything exists? How do I know I don't have an apple here, but we're going to imagine I have an apple? How do I know this apple exists and is not a projection of my consciousness? This is the big epistemological question. Well, Husserl's like, you have to kind of nudge yourself up to this, state of self-reflection on your own content of your own consciousness, and perform an exhaustive description, of that particular empirical apple. And the apple might be it might be lumpy, it might have a longer stem, it might have a little brown spot, the red might be fading into orange, it might be kind of tilted over on one side. It's a particular apple. It's different from any other apple that exist in the world. It's its own thing. At the same time, there's something about it that makes it an apple. There's something about it that has a kind of essence of appleness, of pure appleness, that makes it belong to, a kind of almost platonic, category that is larger than itself. I should say I'm stealing a lot of my understanding of this from James Dodd, who helped me through Husserl many years ago when I was banging my head against the wall trying to figure out what exactly this intuition of essence versus empirical intuition was about. I'm sure he could explain it to you better, but for our
And
purposes,
he's one of our mentors, and he's one of our mentors
okay,
in that
wonderful.
program.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, so you
They're
guys can
appropriate
get a better, more detailed explanation from James at some other point. But my metaphorical use of it here is that any given moment in time has elements about it that are irreducibly particular, that demands that the historian, the writer, describe them in their particularity. The concrete details are very important. You know, I'm always telling my students too, when you write, when you talk, you need concrete, empirical, specific stories, not generalizations. You know, you need real people, you know, who are dressed in a certain way, who like wear their hair in a certain way, who are speaking in a certain way, who show up at a certain place at a certain time and are doing something. You know, you need not just the abstract, you need the very particular, you need those empirical narrative details. Otherwise, nothing is real. You know, any given moment, anything, anyone going for a walk or buying a cup of coffee, there's something irreducibly singular about it. Every human being is irreducibly singular. You need that when you write. You need that to make a connection with the audience. But you also need, you know, in some way, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes subsequently, to be able to kind of tease out from the irreducibly singular elements of a universal essence. And in that sense, that Husserlian methodology, which gets, you know, much more technical than I'm competent to explain, I think works very well as a historical methodology, because ultimately you want your reader to be able to envision both the singular empirical, but also that kind of universal essence. And one of the things that was very important to me in the Maidan book was to write a kind of phenomenology of revolution such that my interlocutors were describing their experience of revolution in very personal detail. And then I was trying to convey that to the reader in such a way where through all this very intimate and personal detail, readers could also potentially extract things that spoke to them as universal. You can also see some parallels with the Stanislavski method. I mean, you can feel like you're always working along these planes of the singular and the universal. Okay, maybe I'll just say a few more things and then you can ask me questions. That's so one of the things when I go to American audiences, I always have both concrete, tangible stories about individuals. Groups are always abstract. I mean, the old saying that is sometimes attributed to Stalin that, you know, one person's death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic, you know, is unfortunately true for the way the human brain works. If you want the audience to connect, you have to give them individual people. You don't need Stalin for that. You know, novelists understand that. I mean, Slavenka Drakulic understood that, you know, when she wrote her novel, you know, S, A Story of the Balkans. You know, there were countless numbers of these women who experienced mass rape, who experienced unwanted pregnancies. She writes a novel about one person. And by the end of that novel, you feel deeply attached to that one person, that one experience, in a way you could not get attached to the whole group, the whole collective. So you need that to reach the audience. And then you need to have a way to make them understand that even in that particular experiences, there are things that will speak to their own experiences or experiences of other people they've known. So the issue of analogies, I think it's not an either or, it's a how. You know, translation is always going to be imperfect, but that doesn't mean it can't be better or worse. The other thing maybe I'll just say briefly about approaching audiences. And I know I have a huge luxury here because I'm not Ukrainian. I feel like I'm watching my friends and colleagues, you know, be slaughtered in real time over the internet. And I'm the one going to American journalists and politicians and students and people on the right and people on the left and trying to explain to them why they should care. One thing I try very hard to do, and again, I have the luxury to do, is to be very generous. I don't go in with an attitude that I'm already angry that they haven't paid attention before. You know, I already, I'm already resentful that, the rest of the world has paid too little attention to the part of the world I study. I try to go in there with a kind of generosity about the fact that the world is big. Horrible, unspeakable things are happening to people all around the world every day, and none of us have, the emotional, or capacity or the resources to take in all of that all around the world every day. Like there is no kind of boundless limitness that you can connect, specifically with that many people across that much space in that many different places. So I start out with a position of generosity. I'm not angry at anyone who has not paid attention in the past. My job is to reach out a hand to the audience. My job is to epistemologically, optimistically assume that some kind of understanding is going to be possible. And that our job is to kind of get us to this understanding. And one of the challenges with Americans, I find, is our monolingualism. And I would argue, although I can't prove this, that monolingualism is not just a linguistic deficit, it's an imaginative deficit. If you grow up bilingual, I mean, this is one of the reasons for my biases on the language question in Ukraine, because I feel like bilingualism, multilingualism is such a huge advantage. Not just in terms of the particular languages, but in terms of the meta understanding of how language works. If you grow up bilingual, if you grow up code switching, you can theoretically imagine, what it would be like to think in a third language or a fourth language. You know what it means that the world can exist in more than one language. You know what it means to kind of flip that switch in your brain. If the world has only ever existed in one language, if you have never been able to function at all or have a thought in another one, the second language is unimaginable. It's not real. And I think in many ways, subliminally for a lot of Americans, things that happen in languages other than English are not quite real. Not necessarily for, racist reasons or for reasons of any kind of conscious dislike or, or hatred, but just if you've never been outside of a single language, the idea that the world could exist with just as much reality and detail in another one, I think is unimaginable. And so I think that ability to code switch, I think it opens our minds in certain ways. There's for those of you who haven't immersed yourself in American film, there was a fantastic film that came out by Spike Lee called Black Klansmen on the 1-year anniversary of the Charlottesville riots, which was early in the Trump administration. Ku Klux Klan white supremacists come out in Charlottesville, Virginia, the site of the University of Virginia, and start beating up students, and one person was killed. And they would like to have white Aryan supremacy in the States. And on the occasion of the 1-year anniversary, Spike Lee came out with a feature film which was based on real events, although this was not a documentary film, about a Black police investigator, I think in the 1970s, who infiltrates the Ku Klux Klan. And you think, how is it possible if you're Black to infiltrate the Ku Klux Klan? You can't really pretend to be a white supremacist, but he has a Jewish colleague on the police force who shows up in person, and the guy infiltrating, who has the idea and who constructs the plan, is talking to the Klan leaders on the phone. And when he first does this in the film, and his colleagues at the police force overhear him impersonating, successfully, an Aryan white supremacist, they say, well, how did you do this? I mean, how did you speak that English that made you sound like you were white? I mean, you come from this Black community where they speak this, other version of English. And the guy, Ron Stallworth, says, well, I speak both. And his colleagues don't understand because they don't understand bilingualism. They don't understand code switching. And essentially, even though it's English and English in two different versions of English, it's just a form of code switching, which anyone who has ever spoken more than one language understands what that means. I mean, sometimes you're speaking one language, sometimes you're speaking the other language, and he code switches. Americans are very bad with code switching. So one of the first things you have to get them to understand is that this world that's existing in another place, most Americans have never had a passport. and in another language is just as real. And you assume that they are capable of understanding that to some extent. I try never to come in with issues about inferiority or superiority. I try to kind of put all that aside. You know, I try to kind of invert these paradigms from, you know, people who have been oppressed are superior, or people who have done the oppression are superior, or we're going to invert that. I try to put that aside as much as I can and imagine ourselves working on this kind of horizontal plane. And one of the ways I do that is that in my own field in intellectual history, there's a lot of the intellectual history of Eastern Europe that's been done. There's been a sense of kind of, you know, insecure compensation. Like, well, look, you know, we have some good philosophers too. Or, well, look, there are these great ideas being produced in Paris and Berlin. And then like they influenced, you know, they influenced the Hungarians or the Poles or the Czechs or the Romanians. And like, look, we had a little response to it. And I'm going to kind of fill in the gap, and I'm going to like write something about, you know, Hegel's influence on the Ukrainians, or, you know, how like the Romanians read Heidegger, or, you know, how the Croatians read Kant, or like how, and another thing that I kind of owe a lot to Tishner and to Krasnogruda is to move this idea of influence, that someone is being active and somebody is being passive, and somebody is the creator and somebody is the receiver, to this idea of encounter. Yusuf Tishner has this kind of philosophy of the encounter, of the spotkania. It's very Levinasian. And the idea that when people encounter one another, something potentially happens. Something creative can then come about. You know, and it doesn't have to be a kind of master-slave dialectic encounter. It can be an encounter. You know, so I'm trying to bring Ukraine at the moment, you know, sometimes other people in other places, into an encounter with audiences that are not Ukrainian. You know, and I try to lay aside all sorts of issues, you know, that are inflected with feelings of inferiority or superiority or both, and try to imagine we're in this world where there can be some kind of exchange. There can be some encounter. People are potentially open to learning about one another and to learning from one another. Now, this sounds a little bit utopian, but if people show up at my lectures, it means they have some openness, you know, and I'm going to like give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to give them some goodwill. The other thing, and this is more morally problematic, I suppose, so we can talk about it, is the relationship between empathy and voyeurism. You know, so one of the things that I've been kind of, you know, tortured about for a long time, less so at the moment because I'm kind of following the Ukrainians' lead here, is that in order to get your foreign audience to make that imaginative leap and to empathize with people in times and places they themselves were not, you need intimate details. Again, you can't have the abstract collective. You can't have the generalization. You need particular details about particular people's lives. That always involves, and historically, like when you're writing about people who are dead, it's less morally problematic because, okay, you're talking about who was sleeping with who, or who was chain smoking, or, you know, who put too much chocolate or sugar into their coffee, or, you know, okay, but they're dead. So like, you know, you don't feel like you're embarrassing them too much. Although every once in a while, like Bruno Yashensky, his second wife, was apparently really obese. And everybody kind of talked about this. And I said something about this in my first book, and the copy editor, who was very gentle and generally didn't make any content-based interventions, sent me this email, and he's like, you know, Marci, this woman like went through Stalinist terror. She was in the camps, you know, her husband was executed. Maybe we could leave out the obese. Maybe we could maybe it's kind of humiliating to her. I mean, she's long dead, but even so, and I was like, maybe you could find a more gentle way to say that, you know, which was a point I took. But these kind of voyeuristic details, both people exposing their emotions, you know, and these kind of concrete details about their lives. The precondition for empathy is voyeurism. The precondition is the violation of intimacy, is the violation of privacy. And so you're asking people to expose themselves in the interest of helping other people understand. I was very tortured about this when I was writing The Taste of Ashes, and I let people censor things and take things out, and then I tore my hair out about other things. The Maidan book I relied on the generosity of my Ukrainian friends and colleagues, and I was kind of blown away by how many people let me use their stories. Not everyone I talked to, but most people I did said, yes, like you can record this, you could use it. I want the world to understand. And now during the war, you know, I find too that my Ukrainian friends and colleagues, like their attitude is, we want people to understand. Like, yes, you can quote me. Like, yes, you can. I mean, in all these private correspondences too, I'm always like, can I quote this? Can I cite that? Like, can I tell this story? And of course, it's personal. It's pretty. Very intimate and irreducible this gaze of the public. And I see how many willing to do that, you know, in the interest of trying to build a bridge. And that's a decision I can't make for other people. But once they've made it, I try to make as good use of that as I can. I try my best to convey those stories with dignity, even when they involve a lot of exposure, you know, and suffering. I try to be the mediator who can remind my audience both what is so personal it can never be replicated, you know, and what is also speaking to something, you know, in their own lives and something that they could relate to. So I probably talked too much now. I said a lot of things that were kind of general. I'm happy to answer your questions or listen to comments.
So what we are going to do, Marci, now is in a short while, or actually right now, we'll bring our 3 fellows in. They are going to engage with you in the conversation. And in the meantime, let me just say, I listened to everything kind of sitting on pins and needles. That's how excited I was. And I was thinking all the time about this epistemological questions, that thread that, you know, in your talk about historians and others, you know, like social scientists, or about your students who come to you with questions and about this gift of thinking in terms of metaphor or metaphorical thinking in general. So I don't know whether you know, but there is this extraordinary sociologist, Zimmel. And Zimmel wrote this small piece on bridge and door. And in that piece, he said, those who first built a path between 2 places performed one of the greatest human achievements. He explores that the 2 objects as forms, both doors and the door and bridge, that capture a sense of separation and unity. And I think that this is what your talk was about. You know, how to every bridge and door reveal a linkage between, you know, connection and detachment at this distance, right? So I'm just defending some, you know, I'm just defending sociologists here. Conversation. And let me just introduce our fellows. As before, we have 3 fellows. Andriy Hrinchuk is from Lviv. He's from the Department of History. He's a student of Yaroslav Hrycak, who was our first speaker here, and Department of History of Ukrainian Catholic University. And his topic, his studies, this is just the beginning of his studies on the PhD level. It's about Ukrainian minority in the Second Republic of Poland, which is the interwar period of Poland, and its ways of reaching out to the larger international audience, which is the League of Nations at the time, organized by the League of Nations. Andriy Hrinchuk. Ruslan Zaporizhenko, from the Department of Political Science and Political Sociology, studies at the Kharkiv National University, Karazin Kharkiv National University. And his topic, or his title, which I like, is Ukraine, no longer a subaltern, ? Processes of velvet decolonization and the post-imperial space. Maria Shinkarenko is our own new school for social research student who is from Kiev, who came to Wrocław at some point, and then she applied to the new school, and in a few months she's going to defend her PhD project. She is the Department of Politics, and the title of her project is Identity as Capital, Crimean Tatar National Movement from 1950s to the present. So you have three people. As I said, because you are not Ukrainian, although you very much, I think, can be taken by, you are Ukrainian in many ways when you talk about, and when we listen to you, we wanted to have people just from Ukraine to talk to you. So here we are, and perhaps I will just, let me just start with Ruslan Zaporozhenko. And the next, and then you will answer, and then we will move to Andrei Hrinchuk, and maybe Maria Shinkarenko will be the last one, as she's from.
I believe Ruslan has some technical issues, so if we can wait a little bit. Let's bring him back on Zoom.
No, that's right. Let's try on Zoom, and we will meet on Zoom later on. So, so let's start with Maria, with Masha Shinkarenko. Let's reverse the order. Yeah. Masha.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Elżbieta, Lala, for organizing this, and a big thanks to Marci for your wonderful talk and for everything that you've been doing in the last 6 months and before that, of course. I learned so much from this talk, and it's a lot of very rich material. And as a PhD student who in politics who is grappling with a lot of questions, the epistemological questions, trying to think about identities and how to interpret interviews and fieldwork experience in a way that you think accurately conveys what people were actually saying and not what you think. So all that was very useful. And I have, I guess, two questions that kind of came to mind. So one is kind of directly to one of the things that you were talking about, this metaphor of bridges, and I really love it so much. And I think a lot of Ukrainians who have lived abroad or have access to international audience in the last 6 months felt also like you could apply this metaphor to us too. We trying to convey what it's about Ukraine as much as possible. But I feel like there is also this definite kind of power dynamic in this communication that I noticed, and this has also been, I think, articulated by many colleagues, that when Ukrainians are talking about the war, even though we are scholars, or I mean, not necessarily scholars, but people who are competent to talk about political processes or history or culture, Ukrainians are always kind of, or maybe not always, but very often are taking as kind of this biased side party, like too emotional, too irrational from what is going on, and then the kind of more authoritative figures from outside, like yourself, or I mean, scholars, kind of Western scholars who have been studying Ukraine, are seen more as objective, and therefore have kind of more influence, more leverage to convey, and they will be perceived more as what they are saying is the truth. So what, I'm just curious, what do you think of this, and how how this can be overcome, this distinction? And so that's one question. And then another question is for you as a historian, and it kind of doesn't directly relate to your talk, but I'm still very curious to hear what you would say to that. So I guess since the war has started, I've been reading kind of rereading a lot of history from the last century. And what struck me is how similar the European States Act behave today in comparison how they acted 80 years ago. This whole, you can hear people saying that, oh, this such and such state is on the wrong side of history again. And the kind of paradox is that while kind of Russian mantra is we can repeat, the European mantra is we cannot repeat. And kind of with all the long and painful process of rethinking history and memory. And so kind of despite these assumptions that the Europeans have learned their lesson and are very afraid to repeat it, they kind of still end up repeating it with kind of their reluctance to act decisively, or conversations about not to provoke. So what would you agree with that? And what does it tell us about drawing conclusions from history in general? I mean, we have two opposite sides, one side that didn't learn anything from history and another side that learned anything from history, but then it kind of keeps repeating. So I'm just curious to hear what you're thinking about that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Well, I can say a couple of things to that. First of all, yes, I have been, one thing I've noticed that a lot of my Ukrainian colleagues have said that we're accused of being too emotional. And we're trying not to be emotional. Yulia Mendel, who just wrote this totally fascinating book about, she was Zelensky's first press secretary. She's probably closer to your age, my age. She's in her mid-30s. She's writing at the Washington Post, journalist. And I've known her for, I don't know, maybe 8 years now. And she was just in New York 2 nights ago. She did the book for the book launch, and she sent me this email, and I don't think I'd be violating too much of her privacy because she did get this in public. And she's like, I started crying at the end and I feel so terrible. Like, I can't be this emotional. I'm going to be better this time. I'm going to be like, and I wrote her back. I'm like, Yulia, I've started crying through a whole bunch of the talks I've been giving on Ukraine. And I haven't apologized for it. I haven't she felt like that was horrible. That was unprofessional. I'm not good. No one's going to take me seriously. I'm not going to be authoritative. Whereas I haven't, I think one of the first talks I did after the war started was with Larry Wolf. I think both of us were crying. I think neither one of us is Ukrainian. The whole, so first of all, the whole idea that you should be there's this, there's a certain kind of myth of objectivity that is then connected to a lack of caring, or it's connected to a kind of emotionlessness. This seems to me quite similar, or I'm going to use another analogy here, to the advice I got, and again, not just me, but all of the women graduate students when I was your age in the 1990s, doing my doctorate at Stanford, and the senior women in the department who were trying to advise us about how to break into this world that was really a man's world. And it was all about, you don't show emotion, you are unapologetically self-promoting. It's best not to have children. If you have them, you should never leave the house while you're pregnant. You should never talk about them. You should not show pictures of them. You shouldn't make coffee for anyone. Definitely don't invite anyone for dinner where you cook. Don't inquire about how they're feeling. Basically any of these things that are stereotypically connected to maternal caring or feminine caring, we're all going to be purged as being unprofessional. And I remember afterwards being at some coffee shop with some other of the women graduate students in my department, and this feeling of okay, so why is the stereotypical uncaring, aggressive, self-promoting male model, why is that normative? Why is that what we should all emulate? First of all, then nobody gets any coffee. No one makes the coffee, then there's no coffee. That just doesn't sound like a very viable situation. But also, why do we assume that that's preferable? Maybe it's not preferable. Maybe these things that were stereotypically associated with femininity, and weakness, and things like being moved by other people's pain, or trying to look out for other people, or caring about children, maybe that should not be purged from the public realm. Maybe in fact the public realm should be moving more towards that. For me, that was one of the inspirations of the Belarusian feminist movement. In that this kind of care, like this kind of ethic of caring taken from feminism should be normative for men and women alike. My colleague Elizabeth Hinton, who works on American race relations and mass incarceration, there was a New York Times profile of her in the wake of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And it was a great profile. You can all look it up on the New York Times. And they published it along with a photo of her. And what was extraordinary about the photo was that it wasn't just a headshot, it was a full body shot, and she was like 8.5 months pregnant. And I loved that. Like, I saw that and I wrote to her and I was like, Elizabeth, that should be our new model. We're going to move from toxic masculinity to like maternal caring. So the first thing I would say is that this idea that any kind of injection of emotion is unprofessional and that is compromising. I think we need to move away from that. Like, I don't think we should be looking at mass slaughter with a kind of cold detachment. I think there's something inhuman about that. It's not clear to me that that's like a normative model we should be moving towards. And I don't think that should be connected with, well, I'm too personally implicated. I mean, I think there is something kind of human about that. Leo, you don't want to be in a world where we're watching people, be slaughtered in mass on the internet, and nobody has any personal feelings about it. That's not the world we want to be in. Now, I also I do everything I was told not to do in graduate school. Like, I talk about my kids all the time. I make coffee for people. I bring snacks. I of course have this luxury because I'm American. And the thing I have been saying at the beginning of my talks too is, it's like, okay, full disclosure, I'm not a neutral observer, not because I'm Ukrainian, but because, these are people I know, these are people I care about. Like, you can't watch your friends and colleagues, being slaughtered, in real time, and maintain, a kind of neutral detachment about it. And I say that right I feel like the thing to do is to kind of own it. And then we should all be asking ourselves, whether this world of cold scholarly detachment is really an appropriate model. But that's just my opinion. The issue about historical repetition. So one of the analogies I've been thinking about a lot is everyone keeps thinking about this. It's not like I'm special. Munich, September 1938, which we were all thinking about in 2014, the little green men show up in Crimea, and we're all thinking about Munich. All of us historians are thinking about Munich. And I was thinking about not just, and then like the separatist rebellion, instigated by the Kremlin in the Donbass. And I was thinking about the Donbass, and I was thinking about Chamberlain's infamous statement to the British, how horrible that we would be digging trenches and trying on gas masks, because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people about whom we know nothing. And I thought, my God, like this, the Donbass is going to be that quarrel in a faraway country between people about whom we know nothing. And the thing about Chamberlain is that, I'm not an expert on Chamberlain, but my sense of Chamberlain is like that he had good intentions, that he was looking at August 1914, and everyone was just a little bit too quick, and this quarrel that was, going on between Serbia and Vienna, and suddenly you end up with a world war, and violence against civilians on a scale that Europe had never experienced. I mean, Chamberlain thought he was learning from the mistakes of the past. And so there's no there's no perfect solution to kind of pay. I mean, I just wrote this piece for Foreign Policy about memory politics, where I make the argument that the Germans feel that they have accepted guilt, for what happened, and they have accepted that German imperialism was worse than anyone else's imperialism, and they are not now going to they're now going to be very cautious about getting involved with violence, and are going to compensation. This guilt responsibility. It's not that the Germans are not thinking about the past, but they have perhaps drawn the right conclusion that might be useful. So thinking about, we're always looking at the past and trying to understand that it's not that something repeated or didn't repeat, but there are kind of elements that we're kind of teasing out, you know, and trying to understand how they could inflect on the present.
Thank you, Marci. And we'll turn to Andriy, who's sitting in Lviv, and here you are. You have your time with Marci.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Lala. Thank you, Elżbieta. Thank you, Marci. I'll make a kind of coming out. The Ukrainian Night by Marci Shore is one of the maybe 3-4 books which are maybe the best intellectual presence to the foreign friends of Ukrainians, which they present, together maybe with Serhiy Plukhy and Mikhailo Vinnytsky. Yeah, when the foreigner comes to Ukraine and you wanna give a kind of intellectual present, most probably you will present one of these books. So we will wait for another one on war. You made one for the revolution, the next one for the war, and I must say that I resonate to this metaphor of bridges very much as well as Masha, and I think that one of the reasons why is because this example, this metaphor from intellectual realm, it corresponds very much to the physical realm. Yeah, I mean that Ukrainian military has blown up the bridges around Kyiv to protect the capital in the most risky days of Russian invasion, and the same Ukrainian military does, in the east. And my guess is that we see the same in this cultural sphere, intellectual realm as well. Ukraine now blows up the bridges with Russia, with Russian culture, and it is not only about removing statues of Pushkin in provincial capitals around Ukraine. It's not only about removing the plaques with streets names of Gagarin, Dostoevsky, and other guys, Russians, out of the walls of the buildings in our cities. It goes even to the academia. I mean that I teach legal history. I'm a lawyer by my primary training, and I teach legal history in the law school of Ukrainian Catholic University. And we had a discussion in our department before the starting of this academic year, whether it is ethical to include into our syllabuses the materials written in Russian. And okay, if not, what about if this is Ukrainian professor who published in Russian? Especially, for example, in my case, if we're talking about Kievan Rus, the most prominent Ukrainian scholar in that field, Tolochko Alexei, he published everything in Russian. So is it ethical to include it into our syllabuses? And we, frankly speaking, we do not have clear and unanimous answer on that question. We don't know what to do. And your phrase, which I do resonate very much to, is that this multilinguistic is much more better than monolinguistic. Yeah. And do we deprive ourselves from monolinguistic to this? From multilinguistic to monolinguistic mode, and the main emotion of Ukrainians towards Russians now is hatred, and this is the mainstream opinion that the good Russian is a Russian which is not visible at thermal backside. Yeah, so. But that is our neighbor, the biggest neighbor, and it will not disappear. There will be no victory parade of Ukrainian troops on Red Square in Moscow. yeah, most probably the victory of Ukraine will be just pushing out of Russians out from Ukraine, and the Russia will exist. So what is the question? Yeah, from my side, the question is, what about these bridges with Russia? They're blown up. When is the time to rebuild them? Shouldn't be any prerequisites from Ukrainian side towards Russians to start to rebuild these bridges, like that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. No, this has been one of the most heartbreaking things to watch. I mean, in terms of like moments that were particularly emotional to me watching, watching the streaming of this war, there was the obrashenia, the address that Zelensky gave to ordinary Russians on the evening of February 23rd, where he said, for those of you in the audience who didn't see it, don't do this. Don't come here and kill us. This is not what we want. This is not what we want our relationship with you to be. If you come here, and you try to kill us, well, we will defend ourselves. That his then famous line, like, you won't see our backs, you'll see our faces. We will look you in the eye. But this isn't what we want. And that was, I thought it was one of the best addresses I've ever seen by a politician. I was an agnostic about Zelensky before that moment. That moment won me over. And it was so real and it was so intimate. And I thought only a native speaker could have spoken like that to other native speakers. Like, it would not have worked in translation the same way. And then another like very wrenching moment a few weeks later when he gives that interview to the Russian opposition journalist over Zoom. And there's a moment at the end where he says, like, it's too late for our generation. We will not forgive. Now what's at stake are our children and grandchildren. Will they ever have a chance? And one of the things that was just wrenching was that you were like, it didn't have to be this way. Like, it didn't have to be this way. There was no the rise of Putinism, what Volodya Rafenko calls the anthropological catastrophe of Russia. It didn't have to be that way. All the families on other sides of the border, like, these Russian soldiers are coming over and killing Ukrainians for no reason. Nothing. They're just slaughtering people for no reason. Like, people didn't need to be enemies. People didn't need to have their families divided. People didn't need to be slaughtered. When I first came to Kiev in 2002, I just spoke Russian to everyone, my bad Russian, but there was never any feeling that anyone didn't want to speak Russian. And when I came back there, after I had met and married my husband, was 2005. So then I had this experience in Kiev, which is like a weird experience to have in Kiev, but like it was very contingent because, so I'm this like crazy American Slavicist who is like, has Polish and Russian, but not Ukrainian, or like could kind of understand it passively. And then Tim is this American Slavicist who had Ukrainian, which he learned at Harvard, but not Russian. Although again, he understands the Russian passively, and so we were like going around Kiev together. And that was when I realized that how bilingual Kiev was, because everyone we encountered switched between Russian and Ukrainian to accommodate these quirky Americans. And I saw that everyone could do it. Like, the taxi driver could do it, like the waiter at the cafe could do it, the philosophers could do it, everybody could do it. Like, they could switch, people like literally like, every 2 sentences could switch back and forth to like make sure we were understanding them. So to me, like, Kiev was such a profoundly bilingual place. And I was so jealous. I was so like, having been raised monolingual, I was like, I would love to be able to do that so cleanly, like so effortlessly. And I never felt like the resistance to Russian language. I never felt in Ukraine until after the war in the Donbass started. And now, of course, it's very extreme. And it like, and it's not my right to intervene. I know this has a kind of, it's so personal for Ukrainians, and, how they feel listening to Russian, and what it means to have this happen with your native language. I did this long kind of interview by correspondence with Volodymyr Rafenko, who some of you might know. he was a Russophone Ukrainian novelist from Donetsk, and one of the very best novelists of his generation. He had won the Russia Prize for literature. He had always written in Russian. His whole life had been in Donetsk. He was a Russian philologist. He taught literature. He fled Donetsk, I think, late in 2014 because of the war, and then started to actively learn Ukrainian once he had relocated to a dacha settlement outside of Bucha. And then he wrote kind of experimentally, his most recent novel, which Mark Andreychuk translated in Ukrainian, but his whole life had been in Russian. And when I met him, he was just like, I'm a Russophone writer, and does Putin know what he's done to people like me? And now when I talk to him, he was never giving up Russian at the time he was living Ukrainian, but now when we were corresponding after the war started, and we're corresponding in Russian, I may be the last person he's willing to speak to in Russian because like I'm this American he likes, but he's like, I will never write another text in that language again. I will never do anything for this culture again. I want to have nothing to do with it again. And it clearly is not my right to intervene. I mean, he and his wife barely got out of Bucha alive. But I also felt like there was something tragic in it. And for him, like for a writer to give up their native language, it's like you're cutting off your right arm. And the only truly decadent thing I did during the coronavirus lockdown was I sat in on Volodya's Zoom course on the Ontologia Literatorii, the ontology of literature, in which we read lots of different things. We read Shakespeare, as well. And we read a lot of Chekhov, and listening to Volodya Rafayenko lecture on Chekhov is just such a pleasure. Like, and he knows every line of Chekhov. He knows every little inflection. He knows every nuance. He knows like that kind of reading with that extraordinary intimacy and sensitivity. Like for him to give up Russia as I just don't want to have anything to do with this. There's something deeply tragic about it. But I also understand that's his right, and he's been through something that nobody should ever have to go through. Will it ever be okay again? What I keep thinking, that I can't predict. What I keep thinking about obsessively, and it's not just me, I was corresponding with Andrei Krasnyachik, and a Russophone writer in Kharkiv, with Yurko Prohasko. It's about Paul Celan. Like I keep going back to Celan. I'm like, will there be a Ukrainian poet who will redeem Russian the way Celan redeemed German? And did we really understand what Celan did with German? And is it now a time we should be going back and looking at what Celan did with German? This goes back to the issue of analogies, and try to understand what it meant and how it happened and how it was possible.
Thank you, Marci. Thank you very much. We have 1 minute, and Ruslan Zaporozhenko just showed up, and it is a very difficult situation. We've been exchanging some lines on chat. He came from the midst of the war. As you know, he is in Kharkiv, and because the power grid was badly damaged several days ago, because of the shelling, he didn't have a connection. He heard you, but he didn't have a connection. We could not see him, and I think we need to finish this part of our meeting because some people have other arrangements. It was to be finished at 11:30, and when we will meet in a minute on Zoom with fellows and mentors, I will ask Ruslan to be the first interlocutor, if I may. Yes, go ahead, Ruslan. You want to say something?
Hello, can you hear me?
We actually do hear you. Yeah.
Yes, one small question, because thanks, Marci, for your interesting presentation. And my questions, how important do you think the role of translations will be after the end of the war in Ukraine? Maybe
that's a great question. Should I wait to answer that until?
No, why won't you answer in a nutshell, and then we will go and we'll dig deeper. Yeah.
Okay, I'm completely biased. I love translation. I think it's an art and a craft, and it's an intellectual exercise, an imaginative exercise. I don't think it will go away. I mean, I think it's part of how we understand one another and understand the world. I don't want to see a world in which everyone starts speaking like internet English and like other languages like melt away. I want to see a world in which lots of languages are preserved, and and people like, people like Jirko Prohaska, who are like brilliant translators, and Riley Costigan and Isaac Wheeler, who are, Serhii Zhadan's young team of, of American translators of his prose. It's brilliant to see what they can do. I don't think it's going to go away. I hope it doesn't go away. I mean, I think it's an imaginative and intellectual exercise that's good for everyone.
Well, thank you with that hopeful message and with that enthusiastic message and with the possibility of seeing the future beyond today. I like to thank Marci. I like to thank Marci very much. I like to thank Masha, Andriy. Ruslan will talk to you in a second. Thank you, Lala. Thank you for everything here to making us safe and stable during this conversation, not just technically. And thank you, Ihor.